Hello and welcome to this video on Warp 1, a unique power curve wave shaper from Joranalogue. Here's what's to come in the video. This video is sponsored by Joranalogue. Now Warp 1 is billed as a power curve wave shaper, and to quote Joranalogue directly, rather than being based on the inherent properties of transistors and diodes, it precisely implements a mathematical relationship between the input and the output, governed by a variable power function. Like a beam of light travelling through a lens, straight waveform segments are bent into hollow-sounding concave or driven-sounding convex curves. The degree of curvature is determined by the exponent control, while the scale parameter determines the depth of the curving action. And Warp 1 stands as something unique in that it's not, say, a typical wave folder or kind of skew-like behaviour, and while this might all sound quite complicated, it's just as easy to use as any other shapers, and like many Joranalogue modules, it provides something immediate and easy with a few knob turns, but offers a deep cavern of potential for what you patch into it and the potential results it can give. It's worth noting up front that Warp 1 is DC coupled, and it's just as happy working with sub-audio CV modulation as its inputs and then processing that into something new and interesting. And it's also, of course, great for audio, and you'll see both in the video. So let's get into the panels and features quickly before we look at how this sounds. Warp 1 is a mono wave shaper, but we have two inputs here that mix together at the input stage. And let's actually just patch a sine in so you can see this on the scope as I do it. We then have our main exponent control, and going counterclockwise adds more hollow concave shapes, and then going clockwise pushes into more kind of standard driven saturation convex curves. And you have the EXP input there to modulate that parameter. We have a symmetry control that adds a voltage offset to that input. And you can voltage control that symmetry by adding a voltage or a different source into that second input. The scale knob acts similarly to a VCA level control, but it's actually scaling the kind of factors within the wave shaping as well, so you do get some shape changes and not just level changes via that shape control. And you also get a CV input there to modulate the scale. The wave shaping can be set direct or hyper. It's been direct so far, and that gives you that thinner shape to the left and more driven saturation to the right, but flipping it into the hyper mode, it makes the exponent values in the shaping negative, which gives a hyperbolic-like transfer function. And again, this may sound complex with its terminology and functions rooted in mathematics, but in practice, it simply gives more extreme wave shapes, as you can see, with much sharper, larger swings in voltage that will push into clipping. And we get a gate input here, the D/H, to actually gate control with external signals that switching. The ABS switch, absolute value switch, is a full wave rectifier. If I take this to something a bit more standard here, you can hopefully see that behavior there on the scope. And that's useful for shaping CV into specific regions, positive only, but it can also create octave up effects for audio. And all of this shaping comes into a precision clipper that has separate positive and negative clipping levels set by their knobs, so you can have a more asymmetrical clipping behaviour, and you have a clip minus and a clip plus CV input to modulate those thresholds. And as a side note, I got fantastic results imparting audio rate modulation just into one side of the waveform via these clipping CV inputs, and that patch appears later in the video. And then finally we have our output stages here, our main output and an inverted copy of that output, and then we have the polarity output here, the pol output, which is a comparator giving a unipolar square wave pulse kind of gate stream from the module, and that pulse width is affected by the different parameters of that shaping. As usual, there's lots of patches in the video exploring oscillator wave shaping, shaping different modulation signals, and then just approaching it like it's a more basic end of chain distortion to see what we can get out of different kind of sound sources and musical scenarios. The patches are on screen now, and as always set up as links in the video description, so skip around as you like, and let's dive in. So a bit like, say, demoing a filter, let's just sweep around the controls over some basic waveforms, see how it sounds. You can see how it looks on the scope, and I won't talk. You'll see me moving the controls on warp 1, but changing the octave, and the wave shape here out of cycle 5, a basic analog set of waveforms. So that's a few basic sweeps of the controls. Let's get into the more musical patches. So I thought we'd stick with sine waves here and take just a basic sequence and really expand that out into these rich kind of accents, PWM-like sounds, more standard kind of rich analog saturation sounds, more hollow, interesting different wave shapes, all within a kind of really dynamic patch that's also firing off some effects accents. In fact, let's start there. If I mute this sound in the mix, when my random gate fires to switch this into hyper mode, I'm taking that sound, which then takes the pulse output into a low pass gate here. Envelope fires open that low pass gate only on that random gate when this lights up red, and then that hits my effects. So the main sound switches into hyper, which is those louder, bigger peak waveform accents we're getting in the dry sound, and it takes the pulse comparator output there from polarity output into a low pass gate to create a kind of little accent effect send. Let's remove the effects for now. Here's just the dry sound, the main output from warp 1. It's just a sine coming in. This will work well on a saw wave though, where it'll be more consistently rich because of that saw wave input, with some shaping and dynamic movement around it. Sticking with a sine though, let's pull out some modulation. And this patch started with me having the idea that if I clip this entirely to 0, I can use these clippers like a kind of interesting VCA, going from clipping the wave out completely and then letting those clip thresholds open back up, and doing that here with a contour 1 envelope. Kind of working like a VCA. If I stop sequencing this and modulating this, maybe come up a couple of octaves, clips at 0 actually zero out the wave here. So as I let more negative level through, or positive, or both at the same time, I'm using them like a VCA. One positive envelope, the positive out from contour 1 opens the positive threshold, the negative output opens the negative threshold. I have an LFO into the second input for symmetry. And I can play around, just letting a little bit of sound bleed through and enveloping in. More there. I have another LFO there to exponent, pushing us through more hollow or richer sounds, those convex and concave shapes. And then playing around with the scale with a quarter note accent, just adding to the overall push and pull and dynamic kind of level shift within warp 1 there. Then taking my random gate to the hyper switch, with some really rich and dynamic shaping. Volt per octave back in. If I didn't want those big level jumps, I'd simply not be switching into hyper. But I like the dynamic, I like the level shifting here. Really feels like it pushes an accent out, and a really crispy sounding one. And doing that, sending again that pulse out through a low pass gate into the effects. Get these little ambient accents around those richer tones too. Let's get into some other sources and patch ideas. So here's warp 1 over some slowly modulating wavetables. The green trace and cables is our input, blue is the output, and at these settings we're hearing a clean pass-through of that input morphing wavetable. Pushing clockwise here, just add that bit of rich saturation. The harmonics just bloom a bit, the bass feels a bit bigger. Into more of your kind of standard clipping overdrive type sounds as we push further around. We can scale that. Add symmetry. And asymmetrically clip the top or the bottom. Going counterclockwise and adjusting scale here. We push into some quite different wave shapes. see this way, rather than just being clipped versions of the input, they actually look quite different. Almost sounds like they're bandpassed. We can really flip that wave around that 0 point. Now going into hyper on that switch, prepare for some level shift. It's absolutely blasted my headphones. With this aggressive shifting stream of pulses. So here's just turning that wavetable processing into a bit of a drone patch. I'm playing an external keyboard for gates and pitch to plats here, which is our wavetable. The pulse output, the yellow trace here, is going direct into a reverb. And that's just droning away, creating some space and ambience against the dry sound. I have an LFO coming into the second input that fades in to create this symmetry when I press a key. You can see that start to wobble around with this LFO that fades in. And both exponent and scale have different envelope shapes. It's going to push a little flurry of clipping and more harmonics at the start of the note. It's always nice just to play patches a bit more musically. So I always find Audiorate modulation interesting, and it's a way of imparting another oscillator's tone and pitch on top of another. Here I have a triangle wave input, a little bit of shaping of it there from cycle 5, green cables and green trace. And then I'm patching across the triangle output from Generate 3 here, tuned higher. And using that to Audiorate modulate parameters on warp 1. Now mixing it in is quite a nice option. You can certainly play around with symmetry and have some fun. But to that exponent there, we've got a nice soft, and this is just full range, there's no external attenuation. It's a nice kind of softness. Yeah, it's kind of soft, rich, warm tone. And this works really well over richer inputs. So this is a sine coming in. It could just as easily be a saw. And the Audiorate modulation still works well. Going to scale. Give a much richer, kind of deeper amount of modulation. And I found it really interesting playing with the positive and negative clips, because you can then just impart that Audiorate modulation just on one side of the wave. For example, just in the negative portions. I'll say just in the positive portions of the wave. Let's try switching into hyper at Audiorate. Almost looks like ring mod. Let's build up a patch with modulator modulation and maybe more than one Audiorate modulator. So here's a patch built around two different bits of Audiorate modulation, both dynamic in that it's modulated modulation and modulating the depth of modulation through two VCAs. And we're finally articulating the sound here in a single channel of a low pass gate. But that sound just straight out of warp 1. And we'll maybe pull out one of the Audiorate modulators. And we'll start with Generate 3 here, which is patching a triangle wave through a VCA into that negative clip. And by having the VCA just slightly open with the Audiorate modulator in it, and then patching an LFO across, we can make that negative clipping Audiorate modulation fade in and out. Now removing that, here's another Audiorate modulator, 2 exponent this time, and it's filter 8. That's going through a VCA with contour 1 as an envelope to it. And you can really clearly hear that being enveloped in rhythmically. So both together. Got a double dynamic Audiorate modulation. And then as I start to sequence all of the oscillators, cycle 5 sine here, generate 3, and filter 8. We've got a consistent, again dynamic double Audiorate modulation, a DDAM if you will, and that's the sound direct out of warp 1. Again, that back into a low pass gate here, with 16th note triggers, and a quarter note swelling envelope, both at the same time. If I had more sources here, I might even go a bit further and add a third Audiorate modulator to scale and really see where we can push warp 1. But it's certainly taking Audiorate modulation very well and doing that dynamically and musically. I think it's really expressive and sounds great. So let's explore creating octave up effects with the ABS switch here giving us a full wave rectification, taking our triangle wave from a standard input bipolar waveform to a unipolar but octave up triangle wave in this instance. And on top of that we can have some fun creating these lovely dancing waveforms and shifting exponent shapes. Here's what's going on. So this is the output that you're hearing direct from warp 1. We have a clean pass-through of our input triangle wave, which is the green trace here. Red trace shows its 0 volt point, so we have a positive and negative standard oscillator triangle here from cycle 5. And the yellow point there below is also 0 volts, with the output being exactly the same, going positive and negative for that triangle wave. And simply flicking on the ABS switch, it takes that negative portion and flips that over, folds it over that 0 point. And in this case, it gives us an octave up effect. Now it doesn't always work. If you had, say, a saw wave, for example, folding that up gives you a triangle wave with a few little glitches in it. But you can hear we go from a bipolar saw to a unipolar triangle. A sine wave, for instance, we do get that octave up effect, but there's some harmonics in there because we don't have that soft curve on the bottom of the wave now. It's actually more of a kind of sharp point, if you like. Now we'll stick with triangles here. And the way I'm animating this patch is very simple. I'll get into sequencing this musically in a moment, but I have on the left side of my mixer here, through a low pass gate, a copy on the split cable of our triangle input. And then the blue trace, the output of warp 1, goes to another low pass gate that's panned to the right with a different rhythm striking it. So simply adding an LFO to that second input for symmetry, that's giving us this nice dancing, rich sounding octave up effect. So here I've expanded this idea of octave up effects, or at least the patching around it, using our root triangle for one layer, our octave up, ABS switch down rectified triangle from warp 1, and I'm also using the inverted out, which is also that octave up effect, for my reverb. Now a really interesting thing, just for that kind of fading background reverb, which is this sound. It's a big reverb with an envelope to the stereo VCA there on the channel. If I don't use that input from the octave up warp 1 version, and I come from the straight up triangle. We have this octave down triangle relative to the rest of the patching. But I really like getting that reverb to sit kind of higher up above that main root oscillator. And then just dropping it back in the mix with a beat. I think it's really interesting being able to place your reverb an octave higher than that line. And let's bring in this extra line here from this other low pass gate channel, which is the warp 1 channel. If I pan this fully right and I pan the main line fully left, you can hear rhythmically that octave up is playing off of that main line here that just rolls around. Going just to the warp 1 line, let's pan that back in a bit here. I'm sequencing symmetry and some exponent shaping, just creating some different accents, different harmonics in there. I think that works really well against the dry line. Now panning them about 10 and 2, just for a little bit of stereo space. Beat back in, and that reverb. So let's take a look at shaping envelopes with warp 1. And I'm playing a keyboard externally here. And I have the same sound patched to 2 different low pass gates. It's just a pulse wave. And my green trace green cables here is my envelope. That's controlling the sound in the left side, hard left low pass gate in the mix. And the output of warp 1 here, blue cables and blue trace, are controlling my hard right panned low pass gate. So anything that we do to this envelope on warp 1 here will then appear on that right hand side, and we'll see the differences on the scope. With scale up full, I have a 10 volt ADSR style envelope, and we can reshape that with the exponent. You can see into tighter envelopes, and you can hear that sound's not hanging around in the right side as much as it is in the left. If we just listen to the output of warp 1 and I pan that mono, you can see we get very tight, short envelopes that then get longer, bigger, longer shapes as those decays are kind of bloomed up in gain into that clipping. Going hyper, I really like that you get that little blip through first. So quite different again when the original's panned left and that's panned right. So that's quite a basic example. I just wanted to show these shapes before we kind of put them into musical context. Let's have some fun with it, shaping envelopes. So here we're having fun with some envelopes. Just a basic decay envelope, the blue trace here, and by clipping them, we're adding a hold stage that kind of simulates saturation. At least it sounds like that to my ears. And by kicking in at that hyper switch with a random gate, it sounds to me like we're punching in a kind of glitch effect where we're repeating the sound. But what it's doing is inverting the envelope, or more of a flip or a mirror. It's not making it negative, as in going through 0 from a positive to a negative. It's staying within its voltage range, but kind of mirroring the shape. But just looking at the clipping first, this is my envelope coming in, blue trace here. Yellow trace comes out and modulates my filter's cutoff. And it's the vari wave output from cycle 5, which has been modulated by the inverted out, so an inverted version of this yellow trace, while the main out modulates that filter cutoff. If I play around with the exponent here, I can go to tighter, shorter envelopes that have this kind of hold stage at the top. It's like a rise, hold, and release or fall. When before it was simply just a rise and a fall, or an attack and a decay. So by playing with shaping that and also shaping the symmetry to elongate that hold stage, and I'm doing this with a slow LFO. So I have a copy of my LFO here into the exponent, and an inverted copy into symmetry. And it's just a repeating sequence of volt per octave and my gates to my envelopes. As that red trace LFO rises there, you can hear it kind of sounds like we're pushing into saturation in the audio path. And it's not at all. That's simply clipping the envelope to add a hold stage to it. It goes from this kind of more quiet and delicate to more big, energetic sounds. And if I was to flick this into hyper, we get that mirror where my decay envelopes turn to rising envelopes. So by kicking that in and out, a bit like stamping on an effects pedal. Just occasionally we get these lovely swells. I really like this kind of intricate envelope shaping, adding hold stages by clipping them, recurving and shaping them for more or less energy in the filter. And that mirror or flip kind of inversion that happens, random gating in the hyper switch there, I think is a really powerful effect. So here's a really fun patch just throwing loads of random voltages at warp 1 that's processing just a basic rise and fall envelope here out of contour 1. Let's break it down and I'll show you what's going on. So outside of warp 1 we have these drums that you're listening to, and some bass, which is cycle 5 into filter 8, PWM into a driven filter, a little bit of walk 4, hear that moving around of that filter. That's going into a VCH with a quarter note envelope, ducking it. Just for a good kind of bass in the background. But the main part of the patch here is plats. And this all comes from one envelope here that's been processed through warp 1 with some random voltages. If I patch this across and you look at the yellow scope, the yellow trace on the scope, that's the envelope out of contour 1. It controls the level of plat sound here in a low pass gate, but that's what's going into warp 1 to process said envelope. And I'm just kind of throwing random voltages in, 2 sample and holds that are addressing the exponent and the scaling there on warp 1, and then a walk 4 voltage, so stepped Brownian walk that we can think of just like stepped random here, although there's a bit more to it. Check out the walk 4 video if you haven't. That's then coming in as a symmetry here. These stepped voltages, walk 4 and the 2 sample and holds, are on stacker cables, and they're coming across to modulate the sound on plats there. And you can see we're just getting these shorter, longer feeling envelopes done. Nothing's been modulated on the envelope. Sustained, symmetry pushing and pulling the level around. So against the drums, my basic arpeggiating plat sound, excited by random voltages, and a highly dynamic shifting envelope shape, processing that basic envelope through warp 1. And as a final nice touch, I can take my baseline volt per octave signal as a transposing signal and patch that into plats here with a precision adder. So here's just some utterly nuts processing of a triangle LFO. The green tracing cables there is my input. You can all hopefully imagine what just a simple linear rising and falling triangle LFO sounds like, but with lots of other unsynced triangle LFOs patched into all of the CV inputs and the second input as a symmetry control. This is what we're getting as an output. It's modulating my bandpass filter cutoff here on filter 8, and the inverted version is being attenuated and sent into a quantizer for this frantic run up and down a harmonic minor scale. And where this started was simply just modulating the filter. If I remove the volt per octave here from cycle 5, which is a saw wave coming into filter 8, then that into a load of reverb. Let's remove the verb 2. Here's what warp 1 is doing under all this modulation to an otherwise basic triangle LFO. Bucket loads of big reverb back in. Volt per octave in, which again is the inverted version of this warp 1 shape here through a quantizer. So wave shaping the oscillators you're listening to is a really obvious use case and something we're doing plenty of in the video. But using wave shapers, folders, things to change and morph your waveforms when they're modulation can really ignite and excite a patch. Here we're listening to the full output on Generate 3. This is all coming through some low pass gates I'll get to. Let's just listen to it droning. And if I just pull this modulation, it's the fundamental, and then on Generate 3 you can blend in some even and odd harmonics, which there's just a tiny bit of. It's mainly just a sine wave there. And then I'm using the sine wave out of cycle 5 here, which is the red trace. Cycle 5 is being sequenced in octaves and fifths, and that little biddy-doop, that kind of little glitch, is actually coming from my volt per octave sequencing of Generate 3 there, and it's hard syncing cycle 5, resetting the waveform. So this signal from cycle 5 comes into warp 1, and here's what warp 1 sounds like. Really good. With just 3 running LFOs to the exponent there, the scale, and to symmetry via that second input. And they're just full range, unattenuated LFOs. As you can see, really just dragging that waveform around. So by using that as a modulator, and a modulator for phase modulation, because Generate 3 can do all sorts of through 0 FM and phase modulation. We've got a sine wave through warp 1, phase modulating the sine wave we're listening to on Generate 3. So it's really a patch just to say, give your modulators some love, even if they're Audiorate modulators. Things like FM, phase modulation, AM, it doesn't just have to be basic waveforms on basic waveforms. Now listening to this through a dual low pass gate, this is Generate 3 through the low pass gate with nothing happening to it. I've removed the phase mod. And it's 2 low pass gates, hard left and right with different rhythms striking them. And then let's modulate its phase just with cycle 5, not through warp 1. A nice static analog phase modulation sound there, but that going through warp 1 first. Hiding under these short little musical plucks. You can hear all that motion and movement. Here it is, straight out again, not through the low pass gate. It's such a good sound. And we can go to hyper. So for this one, let's just approach warp 1 as the kind of distortion for whatever sound you want to throw in. So here's a drum beat, we're listening to it through warp 1. Now as I start to shape this, with this really nice kind of lasery kick sound. It's really emphasising that pitch envelope. If I mute the kick coming in, it's really nice, crunchy, noisy sound. Going the other way and bringing the kick back, more traditional clipping-like sounds. They can push into asymmetrical clipping there. Let's go hyper. There we go. So the knob's up at noon, this is kind of as clean as we'll get, and you can hear quite a clean guitar sound here. Rolling up the exponent, we start to get into this kind of low gain fuzz type sound. Pushing anti-clockwise there, we can get into these kind of really spitty, gated, thinner sounds. Flicking into hyper, we've just gone all out, kind of mad, synthy kind of fuzz sound. And you can get back some of that brighter kind of top end by me flicking to the bridge pickup here on the guitar. And it's very rare you'd hear a guitar say through a fuzz pedal then recorded directly. So here's this sound into just a digital simple amp modeler from our typical kind of guitar tone. So over on the DivKid Discord, built up of Patreon supporters, thank you if you're one of those people, we were discussing using richer waves with warp 1 than just your simple kind of sines and triangles. So I set about creating a patch that is a chordal wavetable drawn from Platts here, a common sound source many of you watching might have, and we've ended up in this kind of William Basinski disintegration loops, hangbacked tape, destruction loops, or just all-out broken, but weirdly kind of ambient and engaging sound. Let's get into what's going on. So kind of neutralising the settings here, this is the sound of Platts. LFOs to chord type, the intervals, an inversion of those notes within the chord, and the wavetable tone. And just turning the knobs here to see what happens, we can push clockwise on that exponent into more standard, blown out tapey kind of analog saturation curves that you might expect. We're going counterclockwise. We get this very kind of broken, like spitty gated fuzz pedal type effect. And if you're not into this kind of like degraded, distorted sound, this maybe isn't for you, but if you are, like I am, I find this really engaging, just that movement, fuzziness, brokenness. I think it's really interesting. So adding a very slow LFO here, yellow cables and yellow trace to exponent, we'll push further into that, through that neutral mid position and towards some clipping. And I'll use this red trace, slightly faster LFO to scale. I've been listening to this for ages. I'm really enjoying myself. But muting this sound, here's the pulse output. Let me just cancel out some effects here. Just hard, squared off. No smoothness, no anything. Just brutal square wave stream here from the pulse out. It's coming into a filter. And then feeding some effects, which is a high pass and a big reverb. And that being super fuzzy and wide against the dry sound. It's really nice with this kind of like broken tape failure-esque distortions over more ambient sounds to add a load of depth and width. With that background reverb. But for that background reverb not to just be the sound itself, but to be that extreme, rich pulse output, filtered and then swirled around in this big reverb. If I mute it, you can hear all that dimension disappears. It adds that depth to the mix, and of course that stereo width from a stereo output too. But hearing this all crackly and broken, I got to playing around with noise, and at first I just patched it into the second input here. Which, if I attenuated that externally, just to bring it down in the mix, I think would work well just mixed into the sound. Just background noise, you could filter that, create something a little bit warmer. It plays into what we're doing here with this kind of degraded destruction ambience. But playing around with noise as a modulator, I'm going to patch it into clip. Let's turn off this reverb. It's in the negative clip here, so as I bring that up, we can introduce these vinyl crackle style, little crittery, glitchy sounds. And then finally, I've patched feedback, inspired by the disintegration loop or destruction loop thing, but there's no actual delay and looping mechanism here. It's just the pure sound out of this split cable into an attenuator down here. I'm just going to move this knob, as you'll see at the bottom of the screen. That's going back into the input 2 here, so purely output routed back to input as feedback. And we can really emphasize and kind of blow out that sound. Reverb back in. If you're a purveyor of noise and filth and ambient sounds, then I hope you've enjoyed it. If not, I imagine you've switched off at this point. I really enjoy, the destruction, really kind of as a bipolar opposite to that quite nice chord tone on the way in. If you've got this far in the video, drop a walk sync down in the comments. Check out the video we made for Walk 4 recently that released at the same time as Walk 1, that's linked down below, and there's a Patreon exclusive video for Walk 1 that you can gain access to at patreon.com/DivKid, along with lots of other exclusives and the chance to join the DivKid Discord community. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!